Good morning. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce to you one of the first people I met and quickly grew to admire when, as a fresh graduate of Southern Virginia, I went to work in Williamsburg, the former capital of the colony of Virginia. Today's guest attended the historic College of William and Mary in Williamsburg from 1760 to 1762. In 1769, at only 26 years old, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he served alongside George Washington and Patrick Henry. At 33, he penned our nation's foremost founding document, the Declaration of Independence. He then served as the second governor of the newly formed Commonwealth of Virginia during the war years, 1779 to 1781. While serving as governor, he penned the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the first of its kind in a government by and for the people. He later served as ambassador to France for our young country. He served as the first Secretary of State under George Washington, was our second vice president, and our third president. He is also known as the father of the University of Virginia. But despite all these accomplishments, he prefers most to be known as a farmer from Virginia who's come a 2.5 days ride in the saddle from Monticello to visit us today. My friends, please welcome Mr. Jefferson.
Say citizens were I to make the effort to take the hands of each and every one of you here today, that would take up all of our time together. So suffice it to say, a good morning to you. My delight to be here at your center of learning. I will tell you, as Ms. Clough made mention, that she knew I was making my way southwards here, 75 miles from where I reside, 900 feet above sea level. I couldn't help but be startled last evening with a loud roar from Buena Vista here, and later learned of the happy victory of the Knights here in your community. Happy to hear that Virginia is persevering over North Carolina, so this is a great delight as well. And citizens, if you would allow for the short time that we have together here, that I might reflect, if you will, upon the length of that journey I just made, somewhat as an introduction, and then to reflect upon the experiences I had when I was your age, and then finally to make commentary upon that for which I've been revered as author. Nothing could please me more as I commence to think that the President of the United States has entered this chamber and you all remain seated. Because in my opinion, that is exactly the way it ought to be. For lest we forget as Americans, who holds the reins of our government? The people. You do. You do. And that is the great office which you will soon enter, particularly bolstered by the education you receive here, supported, if you will, with your reflections upon the past, the reading of history, which will support you as you enter that office. Without one single office in our government, whether appointed or elected, may be seated when you enter the office of citizen. Many of you already are. And that is why, in my opinion, to remain seated to your leisure, your pleasure, and your comfort is so indeed reassuring to me as I continue in that obligation, let alone an honorarium as your public servant, to remain standing here in your presence. Ms. Clough mentioned that it was a 2.5 day ride, and I was delighted as I was able to see you have a clock tower here in town to set my pocket watch, because I've always said that a town, a village, is the most civilized when it has a clockmaker. It puts us in mind of this most valuable of human commodities. It puts us in mind of time. Time and the common sense to reflect that when time passes, well, I ask you, is it easy to get it back? No. To utilize every moment, particularly in your youth, is to create a greater happiness as you grow older. That your time will fulfill itself. I thought as I rode southwards here, it still takes me the same amount of time to cover any distance in the saddle as it did when I was a young man. When I made that journey from Charlottesville to Williamsburg, 120 miles, I still cannot accomplish 120 miles in the saddle in any time less than 5 days. Those of you who own a horse would well understand you never travel more than about 35 or 40 miles a day, so as not to tear out your horse, let alone yourselves. You'd never travel over a long distance than 5 miles an hour. That is a comfortable pace. If you tried to travel 6, 7 miles an hour, it would soon prove unsettling to the digestion. And consider most people upon the globe do not even own a riding horse. No, that's a great privilege. They're expensive to purchase, to breed, to maintain. Most people upon this globe travel one place to the other. How so? Walk, your God-given method of transportation. Your own 2 feet, which will take you comfortably 3 miles an hour. Now ponder that respect in the world in which I reside. The calculation, if you will, of the minority, those privileged to own a fine riding horse that ride comfortably 5 miles an hour. The great majority have not the privilege. They walk comfortably 3 miles an hour. And there you are, citizens. Lest you forget, I certainly have not. I live in a 4-mile-an-hour world. That's the world in which I reside. I know of no place upon the globe where you can travel any faster than a ship at sea, a horse on land. Now, I will not deny there have been remarkable improvements. And the greatest improvement for transportation that I have come to know is that steam-empowered mechanical device. The very first ones engaged in our civilization. Would anyone know what was a steam engine placed within to provide it a steady propulsion against the vagaries of nature? Any idea? No? A boat. A boat. It was placed in a boat to allow it a steady propulsion against the vagaries of winds and currents. The very first ones in North America were employed in boats on waterways. Here in Virginia, the Upper Potomac across from Shepherdstown by a Virginian, James Rumsey. At the same time in Philadelphia City, Mr. Fitch, John Fitch, placed a steam engine in a boat on the Delaware. Neither of them could travel any faster than one could achieve speed on horseback. Later, a good friend of mine, a very wealthy tobacconist in Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson, devised a method of placing a steam engine in a cart. He placed the cart on 2 rails parallel that would provide it a steady propulsion against the vagaries of terrain. Now, I know you're all thinking, well, that was an improvement. Well, yes, but it could not travel any faster than one could achieve speed on horseback. Perhaps some are now thinking, Jefferson, it's about time you get modern. So I will, for the only improvement I know in the steam engine was improved for travel upon water. That is as far as I will know. It was brought about by my good friend, a former collaborator on our Declaration of American Independence, Robert R. Livingston, our mutual friend, Robert Fulton. They improved a steam engine. They placed it in a boat on the Hudson River to sail the distance between the port of New York and Albany City in New York, a distance of 150 miles. And will we ever get over it? It made that distance in 36 hours. I declare, is that not phantasmagorical? I cannot help but ponder what's next. To think that someone may travel a distance of 150 miles in 36 hours, to think that someone in Albany may know what has happened in the port of New York within 36 hours is extraordinary. It boggles the modern mind. Where will we be in the next century? Where will we be in the next 2 centuries? Could it be that in the 21st century that our information will travel so swiftly, faster than a timepiece as we move forward into the future. And yet, citizens, I make this statement with a caveat that we should bear in mind always, that as we travel more swiftly into the future, be cautious, because our past will travel equally as swift behind us. And this concerns me, citizens, because could it mean that as we venture into the future, we will be more prone to forget what happened yesterday, which is so vital that we might better understand what is happening today. Particularly not to forget those principles upon which our nation was founded, the most remarkable nation in the history of man, founded upon principles of equal and exact justice, founded upon principles of opportunity and equality for all. The first nation in the history of man founded upon principle, not upon monarchy, royalty, aristocracy, principles of self-government. That we might never forget that while we were referred to as a radical rabble in the hinterlands of North America, that we showed the rest of the world, let alone our government 3,000 miles removed, that we were a most civilized people who were able to bring 13 individual nations together. Lest we forget, remember that, each one of the former colonies, distant and disparate one from the other in the degree of religious opinion in one, versus a vast difference in another, in the degree of freeholders in one versus the greater number of tenants living upon the freeholdings in another. We were able to bring that all together, e pluribus unum, through the founding principle of compromise and resolution on behalf of the common good. If I bring you any message here today, that is that we might continue to provoke ourselves to reflect upon our past, to understand how worthy it is to be remembered and employed still in this day, and to provoke us to ponder as we have the advantage in reading history because we know what has happened, that we take a moment and realize they knew no more of what was going to happen on the 23rd of February, 1776 or 18 and 19 than we know what will happen tomorrow. And the more important, what will they say about us in the next century or two? I came here to speak with you upon the great influences in my life when I was your age, that I might not forget, and to remind me and help you as well to savor these moments and to realize what is becoming the most influential that you will carry with you through the rest of your life. I was born out west in Virginia, not this far west, but certainly a 2-day ride west from Richmond. I was born in the wilderness upon a farm that my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, cut out of the forest primeval. It was known as Shadwell Farm. The site is still there, 2.5 miles northeast from where I now live at Monticello. I'm considered a tall man, 6 feet, nearly 3 inches, 190 pounds. My father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, stood 6 feet, nearly 5 inches. He weighed 240 pounds. In fact, there's still a legend today that Colonel Peter Jefferson could lift 2 hogsheads of tobacco and balance it upon his shoulders. Anyone here know the weight of a hogshead of tobacco? Well, speak up, farmers. I'm on your side. Any idea? 1,000 pounds. Now. Legend has it. And yet, citizens, therein is the point. When we inspect legend, when we review legend, when we research legend, what do we often find at its very foundation? Fact and truth. The legend accrues about it to inspire us that man is capable of remarkable feats. Now, in reality, no. My father could not lift 2,000 pounds, but as I have written, in fact, he could survey several acres of land, fence those acres in where the logs already hewn for the project within 1 day's labor. He was a man of a remarkable physical capacity. The more so, he had a remarkably strong mind. He was self-taught. And that which he lacked, he desired for his family. He married well. My mother was Jane Randolph. Perhaps you've heard of them. The Randolph families have a pedigree that goes all the way back through England, ultimately to Scotland, related to Robert the Bruce, to which, as I have written, anyone is free to ascribe merit to that if you so choose. We were brought up with respect to meritocracy, not aristocracy, and we had ample opportunity to see examples of it as we grew up along the Three Chop Road, that main artery of commerce, east-west through Virginia. As you ride west from Richmond into the deep forest, the trees are chopped 3 times every several miles to remind you you're on that thoroughfare westward for a new life for your family. We saw many pass along that Three Chop Road, realizing the risks they were taking, that by their own method they would make for a new life and collectively a new nation. I was one of 10 children. I was the eldest son. I had 3 younger brothers. I had 6 sisters. I know it's remarkable I survived, is it not? We were brought up as Englishmen. We were taught British manners, British customs and habits. My brothers and I taught to bow. My sisters taught to curtsy. And yet, making friends with the Aborigines, from the Latin ab, before the original people, before any others, the natives of this land, in particular the Monacans, we were introduced to that far more amenable and friendly and welcome, peaceable custom of raising your hand as you approach and grasping the hand of your fellow man, realizing indeed you bear no weapon. You seek a faith and a trust, and realizing that those we were wont to consider heathen or savage had an understanding of the family of man across this globe, the enlightenment that we share together, this gift of the great God of the universe. My father desired that we be well educated, so he sent me to a Latin school when I was a young boy, and then later a classical academy on the frontier, the Reverend James Morris Classical Academy, supported by Dr. Thomas Walker at Castle Hill. It was during that time, in particular 1757, that my dear father, only 49 years of age, took ill suddenly and passed away. I was only 14. Could you imagine the responsibility then upon my shoulders to be of what support I could for my mother, left a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children? I knew that as the eldest son, I would inherit great estate at my majority. That is, 21 years of age in 1764. I would inherit over 7,000 acres, 75 enslaved. I'd have open door to Virginia gentry. I could sail the ocean, walk through the portals of nobility. But I knew well by the time I was 21 the greatest legacy my father left me. What do you think? Education. Education, more than wealth, is the greatest legacy any parent may provide their child. It returns tenfold within your life, lifts you indeed to a greater happiness, because education is not only power, education is not only safety, education is happiness. Monies were still left in my father's estate that I could continue my education, and so I rode eastwards at the age of 16 to Williamsburg and enrolled in the Old Royal College of William and Mary. And as I have written, I found myself in the tutelage of one Dr. William Small, who occupied the chair of mathematics and natural philosophy. Now, I doubt any of you have heard of Dr. Small. I can never forget him. I have written a tripartite description of his character as a good teacher that I share with you now. First and foremost, he had gentlemanly and correct manners. We read that the Romans said, manners make the man. I ask you, is that any the less important in this modern world? Citizens, it's more important. It's more important amongst us as Americans in how we treat our fellow Americans, our fellow citizen, how we treat our fellow man, because the eyes of the world are upon us to see how this American experiment will proceed. It is the art simply of showing respect. As I have written, we had a great respect for Dr. Small, and it was by a very simple formula. Dr. Small had great respect for whom? His students, each and every one of us. In his eyes was a new mind never seen before upon this globe, ready to be provoked in the intellect, inspired in the imagination. Secondly, as I have written, Dr. Small had an enlarged, a liberal mind, as I wrote. Well, now the other day I made the statement, a gentleman wagged his finger at me. He said, "Now, Mr. Jefferson, do not become political." I had no idea what he was saying. I said, "I beg your pardon, sir." He said, "Well, you mentioned the word liberal." I said, "Yes, sir, you heard correctly. I hope you have not forgotten the definition of liberal from the Latin word libertas. Simply, it means freedom, liberty of the human mind. The vehicle for education and the cultivation of happiness and enlightenment. The greatest vehicle of happiness and liberty any individual possesses. Not a soul can take it away from you. It is your own. And as I've said, it is but good common sense. It takes just as much energy to be happy as it does to be miserable." He taught in the Socratic fashion, open and free inquiry. As Socrates gathered his students under the shade of the tree in his garden, provoked them with questions, and within the answers, other questions were provoked. And then his students began to realize, bit by bit, that they were becoming the better educated, becoming the more enlightened, because they began to realize how much they did not know. And that education is lifelong. And how when employed early, its returns are manifold. To meet each new day with what we have learned the day previous. And then, as Socrates realized his students were ready, he bestowed upon them that responsibility to realize themselves the privilege of an education. This is now on your shoulders. Go forth and improve the society of man. And lastly, as I have written, Dr. Small had a happy talent for communication. He made learning an enjoyable adventure. There's great wisdom in humor. If you allow me just a divergence for a moment, when I dismounted out of doors, I took off my riding boots, I dusted myself off, yet I worried that I might be observed by you all as musty, dusty from the saddle, perhaps peculiarly apparelled. And so I fess up, I conjured up an apology I was going to deliver before I came here to greet you, but as I ascended this dais, began to look amongst you, I wondered, well, why should I apologize for the way I am attired here today? I've always believed in dressing for comfort, but you overwhelm me in that regard here today. And now I find I'm the more formally dressed, and this is quite different than what I wore when I was your age, attending to the Old Royal College of William and Mary. Fashion style change. And perhaps some of you have read, as I have written, in matters of style, simply swim with the current. But in matters of principle, stand like a rock. I'm referring to the principle of a well-educated citizen body capable of holding the reins of self-government. I took leave of my studies with Dr. Small after 2 years. Many have asked me, "Mr. Jefferson, what degree did you receive?" Well, I fess up. A baccalaureate was not offered at William and Mary until 10 years after I left. I received no degree. I did not graduate from college. In fact, I went home and lived with Mother, which I understand is still a tradition that we uphold as it was. But no, citizens, it had prepared me better than anything else to have been there but those 2 years, to have been guided by Dr. Small. This, the foundation of my efforts, the project of my autumn years, to found a University of Virginia and to seek a universal system of education for our Commonwealth of Virginia and our entire nation, so that a child of Massachusetts may converse with a child of Virginia upon the very same subjects of the founding of our nation, our history, and that those children may speak with others throughout our new nation and to the West upon these principles of equal and exact justice and a government of, by, and for the people. I came back to Williamsburg to begin reading law with Mr. George Wythe, but I rest you assured of this. I have written about Dr. Small perhaps more than any other in my life, he fixed my destinies. That this might remind you all here today of your teachers that will remain of great influence through your life, to help to continue to guide you in what you have learned from them. I spent 3 years reading law with Mr. With in Williamsburg. He only took one student at a time for that period. Perhaps you may know others of his students. Mr. John Marshall, our Chief Justice. Perhaps you also know that no two men could have more of a difference of opinion in the law than John Marshall and me. But that is a testament to the integrity of Mr. With teaching the foundation and the facts of the law, realizing in our nation it is open to every successive generation to argue and debate. And yet in our nation, the people are the ultimate judge, because our laws are made in the legislative body. Another of his students, a young Virginia boy, read law for 3 years and then went to Kentucky, took up residence in Lexington, and he's been elected one of the 2 senators there. Anyone know of whom I am referring to? Henry Clay. Read law with my law teacher. And may I ask you as well, have you heard of the young Kentucky boy whom I hear is quite taken with Senator Clay, looks upon him as a hero? It is Clay that has inspired him to take up reading the law, and he can hardly purchase a book. He hardly has 2 halfpennies to rub together. Do you know of whom I am referring to? Abraham Lincoln. A remarkable future for that germ of law, sown first in Williamsburg to so many and carried on through generations as yet unborn. During those 3 years, I learned 2 facts and principles of English common law. First and foremost, it is grounded in the ancient Justinian Code. That code of civil authority, civil law, first prescribed for civilized man in the 6th century by a Roman emperor, Justinian I. And the foundation of the Justinian Code, lest we forget, everyone is born free. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person and may move wherever they choose to better their condition. That was nearly forgotten through the ages of the darkest ignorance. Had it not been for many a monk, many a scribe in their dark cells through the flick of a candlelight that were able to preserve that wisdom, that enlightenment of the past to help the future to know that the past was not less intelligent than we are today. They simply had not discovered that further knowledge on the frontier of scientific investigation, nor took more boldly that step forward into their future, which is now our present. I used that Justinian Code to defend a slave in the spring of 1770, to defend one Sam Howe in the General Court of Virginia, to remind them that indeed he was enslaved by contracts drawn up not here upon this tabula rasa of North America, but rather overseas, amongst the kingdoms of the Africas and in Britain, to remind them that everyone is born free, that we all come into this world with a right to our own person. And do you know, I could not complete that recitation of the Justinian Code because the gentlemen justices and the Chief Justice, our royal governor, brought down the gavel, requested me to be seated, and found favor in the opposition. This was 6 years before I took up the pen to draft our Declaration of American Independence. That we are all created equal, not equal in face and form, mind you. It's to your great advantage. You look far different than me. We're not created equal in mental capacity. Some of us are of a more acute intellect. Others, we must take our time. But it's common sense. We're all created equal under the laws of nature and nature's God. We are all born free. Well, we are born into the laws of man. And there's never been a better opportunity in human history to rectify the inequality than there has been with the formation of our new nation now. Secondly, I learned from Mr. Witt that laws are living and breathing. They grow with every successive generation. They are through the experience of the future. To realize now what is best to rectify inequalities in the past and contradictions in the past. And this is common sense. Good heavens, I think now as I gaze about you, the number of women in this room during the time that I was reading law, the number that would be approached by the constable, the constabulary, and fined, let alone incarcerated for wearing pantaloons in public. Common sense citizens, a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions grow as we grow as a people. I left reading law with Mr. Witt to practice law for a good 7 years, the general court, let alone the county circuits, 7 years before the monarchy closed down the courts of justice. Mr. Witt had been my mentor in many ways, my friend of all hours, and he was clerk of the Virginia House of Burgesses, into which I took my seat when I was elected to my first public office at the age of 26. Took my seat in the spring of 1769, and I don't know whether some of you have heard from the old-timers still in Williamsburg, Virginia, but I've not been forgotten in my presumption. In my very first day in public office, I raised my hand to be recognized, and once recognized, I asked for permission, merely the permission, to begin an argument, begin a debate towards ending the importation of slaves to Virginia. How do you think that went over? The many that called out, "Who is this upstart from the wilderness? Who is this turncoat unto his own class?" Well, as you know, I've never let them down, have I? And so I continued to argue and debate in the face of great heresies, blasphemies hurled against me, because I know that there is an exalted bench in heaven that awaits me. Because I know that, as we ought to know in our hearts and our conscience, it did not begin when I was born. I was born into this habit and this custom, as was my father, my grandfathers, my great-grandfathers. We have inherited this, and yet where has there ever been a better time in history to rectify it and do something about it? As Euclid purported in his ancient philosophy of geometry, to be able to simply delineate a space, to be able to go forward in description and delineation, it must require a point from which to continue, at which to begin. I was approached by my cousin, the Speaker of the House at the time, Mr. Peyton Randolph. He said, "Cousin Jefferson, this is not the way you're going to win friends or influence people. I guarantee you that. Be not so provocative. Use reason. Use your education to know how to approach an individual in a personal fashion, to take baby steps and help them to understand how this will be beneficial to them. Continue on. You will fail and yet continue beyond that. Never, ever despair. And follow truth wherever it should lead you. Because you should never thereby fear as you follow truth to make things better." Peyton Randolph helped me to understand the foundation of parliamentary procedure, the essence of which is not one individual is above the law. That our nation has been founded under that precept of equal and exact justice, that we are a collaborative effort to argue and debate the improvement of that law. Proper parliamentary procedure being so well known, for that particular advantage, he was elected the first president of our Continental Congress when we convened in Philadelphia, September 1774, and yet he never lived to see me take up the pen to draft our Declaration of American Independence. He passed away in October of 1775, and it was the next year, the extension of that Second Congress, when we learned the first week in June of something that occurred here in Virginia on the 15th day of May, 1776. Anyone know what I'm referring to? What happened in Williamsburg, Virginia, the 15th of May, 1776? Any idea? The gentleman here speaking correctly. On that day in Williamsburg, the House of Burgesses became the new Virginia House of Delegates when it passed a resolution for independency, which was brought for 300 miles to Philadelphia to be read in that collective body. Virginia became the first of all of the colonies to secede. Now, I was going to fib. I beg your pardon, citizens. I I don't want to state something that could not be perceived as factual. Virginia was not the first colony to secede from the crown. Would anyone know which was the first colony of all of us to secede from the crown nearly a month before Virginia proclaimed her independence? Anyone know? No? No? I just heard it. Rhode Island. In fact, on behalf of anyone with relatives or family in Rhode Island, I think we owe her a round of applause. However, Rhode Island seceded only on behalf of herself. She seceded only on behalf of herself. And that is where Virginia made up for it, and on the 15th of May, prescribed that resolution for independence on behalf of her sister colonies. And that is what was read in the Continental Congress that first week in June 1776, provoking an immediate consternation, particularly amongst Rhode Island and Delaware and other colonies. How should they follow the example of Virginia when finally they realize this has been put forth by the largest, the wealthiest, and the most populated of all of the colonies? President John Hancock then appointed another committee of 5 men to do what? To draft a declaration of American independence should it be necessary. This was not a fait accompli by any means. We had to vote on the resolution of Virginia first. Anyone remember the names of the 5 men on the committee? Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman. Last again. Thank you. When we all gathered on the 11th of June to decide who should take up the pen, all of us looked unto whom? No, not me. We looked unto Dr. Franklin. He was our mentor. He was our elder. One of the wealthiest men in all of the colonies. Remember, he was a newspaper man. He knew the facts. He knew the information from all of the colonies collectively. He turned down the invitation. He was honored. He said, "Gentlemen, I am honored indeed. However, as I grow older, I do not care to have anything else I write suffer the scrutiny of a committee." This is true. And he looked at me and he then said, "Mr. Jefferson, I think you're most appropriate." It was Adams, however, who said, "Gentlemen, lest we forget, a Virginian must be at the head of this business." Anyone know why?
Virginia proposed.
Exactly. Where did the business begin? Here in Virginia. It was the next day that I took up the pen in the front parlor on the 2nd floor of a newly built brick townhouse in Philadelphia, built by a German immigrant, Jacob Graff, who could hardly speak English. And for the next 3 days, I penned upon 4 sheets of paper the first draft of our declaration. It took me 3 days to write this. Anyone know why? I share with you something we're all guilty of. Procrastination. No, I'm not going to deny it, but no, citizens, I make mistakes. Is it easy to erase ink? Hardly. I had to cross out my mistake, write the correction above or beneath, and then transcribe that in the evening, and then the next day I'd make more mistakes. And so it continued until finally, that 3rd day I was done and handed it to the committee, and they had their alterations. And we made more mistakes. And then we handed it to the larger delegate body. It was printed up, if you will, in pamphlet form as a support for the arguments and the debates upon the resolution of Virginia. An Irish immigrant by the name of John Dunlap printed up upwards of about, say 25 of these pamphlets. This may be the first time any of you have heard this. They were handed out to the various delegates there. So we had that to go on as we argued for independence. And there were further corrections made to it. And then, of course, with the majority of the colonies voted, we created these states united. Mr. Adams said, "Let us not forget that true birthday of these United States." Anyone remember what is the true birthday of our nation when we all voted? No? The July the 2nd. That day, Mr. Adams said, "Let us revere every year with bonfires, mass bands, and parades." But then we had further work to do. That further work was, of course, to finally vote on our Declaration of American Independence, that the rest of the world could understand what we have done. If you will, this was not a law. It was a letter put forth by a civilized man in proper parliamentary procedure. And so before we began that debate, Mr. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina stood up and said, as New York abstained from the final vote for independency, though we had a quorum to vote for it, the argument over the Declaration must be unanimous. He was seconded by Dr. Lyman Hall of Georgia. And so we began our arguments and debates, and it appeared on the morning of July 4th it would be unanimous, save that Mr. Rutledge stood up again and said, so long as one particular clause remains within the Declaration, South Carolina will not vote to make it unanimous. He was seconded by Dr. Hall. Anyone know what they objected to? The clause I had written referring to the king as a tyrant, for ignoring our petitions to end the importation of slaves, for waging cruel war against a people who never did him any harm. I got up and walked out. I did not return until later in the afternoon, and when I did, discovered that that clause was expunged to maintain political unanimity. Many say, Mr. Jefferson, why did you not stay and argue and debate your work? Dr. Franklin knew why. Mr. Adams knew why. Mr. Rutledge, Mr. Livingston, we all understood, and let alone Roger Sherman, we all knew why. Anyone know? It would not have been proper parliamentary procedure. Our work was done. We passed it to a larger delegate body. This was the answer. But if you will, that argument remains alive. It remains our provenance to continue to argue and debate for generations yet unborn. It's all in that second paragraph. I wish I could tell you that all of these words are original. They are not. The second paragraph is nearly word for word out of John Locke. It was Locke who wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and deniable. All men are created equal. I provided a further alteration, but it was Locke who wrote, we are endowed by nature with certain inalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and property. The pursuit of happiness was my own, to make it the more universal. Is property an inherent right in nature? Let us take a democratical Republican vote. How many believe it is? Is property an inherent right to pursue in nature? How many believe it is not? How many simply do not know? Citizens, the clothes on your back, that's your property. That's your right. Not a soul has a right to extricate it from you without just cause. But what about the purchase of your fellow man? That's our argument and debate, particularly when General Washington called our Declaration the promise and our Constitution its guarantee. To bear in mind that first line of our Constitution, we the people. Let us reflect upon the Justinian Code that we might never forget it. Everyone is born free. Everyone has a right to their own person. That is the first and foremost element of property. You, to which you cannot deny the same to your fellow man. Senator Clay is arguing this, and I'm sure that that young boy in Kentucky named Lincoln will come into the same fray. I have here the formal Declaration of American Independence. This is what I think you may be familiar with. It is what was drawn up by an Irishman in Philadelphia. He was a Quaker, Timothy Matlack, the finest penman in Philadelphia. We hired him to write this and gross it formally that we might sign. He hesitated. Anyone know the reason why? Anyone? Well, more than that, it's an act of war. As a Quaker, he did not hold that as a belief of his creed. And yet he realized all too soon this is what preserves, protects, and defends his inherent right to carry his opinion in religion as he chooses, to maintain the liberty of the human mind as well. Timothy Matlack formally inscribed this document that we all signed on the 2nd of August, save one or two that got around to signing it later. And then Timothy Matlack enlisted in the Pennsylvania militia and became colonel of that militia and founded the Free Quakers, that Quaker sect that will take up arms to protect and defend their inherent right to worship as they choose. The people became aware of our declaration almost the very next day after Mr. Adams and I took the corrected copy down to Mr. Dunlap that evening of July 4th. He printed up 300 broadsides of the Declaration. The next morning on the 5th, they were hammered up on the wooden door and wooden posts. Most of them were handed out to the citizens in Philadelphia. And I will never forget the number. They gazed upon it curiously, shrugged their shoulders, and tossed it into the gutter. Not because they were Tory. There were some, yes, but not because the number were Tory. Anyone know the reason why? They could not read. I remember when I was vested with the responsibility to take up the pen that I had to draft something that could be publicly read, a dramatic piece, and I am no playwright. Something that could lift the human spirit to noble sentiment in recognition of what man can accomplish collaborating with his fellow man. To place before the world the common sense of the matter, that our American Revolution is fought on behalf of the common man, to provide the greatest good for the greatest number, to show the rest of the world that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred ready to ride them, but that mankind has an inherent right to burst forth from the monkish chains of ignorance and assume the reins of self-government. There is nothing new in our Declaration. All of it has been written, argued, debated before. You may find it in the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon Sidney, John Locke, those authors that each and every one of you have read and reread frequently, do you not? No, not all of you, as yet, but rest assured, more here at your esteemed university than we might encounter anyone else. Congratulations in that, because you know the message of the ancients and the enlightenment of this modern world. And that is why I so much appreciate the opportunity to have made my way here to stand before you and to realize, oh yes, you have an opportunity to gaze upon the past, to remember, thank you, but think of my great pleasure to stand before you and see the future. Perhaps some of you have read as I have written. I enjoy much more the dreams of the future than perhaps the history of the past. Thank you. I don't know whether we may have any time, Ms. Glove, do you know? Is there a moment or two for any questions to be proffered? We don't. Well, I hope that you will come visit me. I'm not very far away. And I hope you will continue this American experiment through open and free inquiry, argument, and debate, that we might reassure the rest of the world as to who we are. And therefore, as a last comment, I am delighted to be able to do something before you all with a great honor in your efforts to preserve, protect, and defend your most enlightened religion. Many heresies have been hurled against me, consider me a blasphemous individual, indeed perhaps an infidel, because I wrote the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. For religious freedom, not suggesting a separating of religion from our lives, rather freedom for religion. Whereas I've written, wherever there is freedom for religion, we endeavor the greatest improvement of man. It is not generally known, but I remain on the vestry of St. Anne's Parish in Albemarle County, where I was baptized under the old regime. I have helped to form what has become known as the American Episcopal Church in Virginia. I sit on the board of directors of the Virginia Bible Society, and I am considered absolutely constant in my attendance to church. I never miss a Sunday. When I'm on the road, I carry my church stool with me, so wherever I may find myself, I will not displace another on their own bench, on their own pew. And I have written for the Episcopal Prayer Book a prayer for our nation. Even this is contested and debated. And so therefore, before you engage your prayer, if you would allow, I would like to read mine on our behalf and our nation. Almighty God, who has given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable ministry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from violent discord and confusion, from pride and arrogance, and from every evil way. Defend our liberties and fashion into one united people, the multitude brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endow with thy spirit of wisdom those whom in thy name we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to thy law we may show forth thy praise among the nations of the earth. In times of prosperity, fill our hearts with thankfulness, and in the day of trouble, suffer not our trust in thee to fail. All of which we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.